Hello. Back in the sewing room today. And I am working on another shirt. So this is, so if you watched me last time, I did a blue ruffle sleeve blouse, ruffle sleeve top by In the Folds, which is in the details there at the left. And that was my practice version. I'm now doing a version out of this beautiful fuchsia, pinky red, Liberty Tana lawn, which is a very lovely, very expensive fabric. And so I did the practice version first out of quilting cotton. So now I'm doing the real version. And as you can see, yesterday I got it cut out. And this is the worry I had. The worry I had was I had exactly 2 meters of fabric. And the pattern actually calls for like 2.9. Granted, that's with the full facings. And so I'm not doing the facings are like a lining on the inside. I decided to not do those because I didn't have the fabric. But I managed to just eke out all of the pieces. And that was with really playing some serious sokoban on fitting the pieces onto the fabric. So I managed to get all the pieces out. Yesterday, I managed to sew the body together, the darts. I've also on this one, if you watched the previous session, I've made one other change to the pattern, just because if you'll recall, I had a little, when I was pulling my arms forward, I felt a bit of pulling across the back of the garment. So I've done a broad back adjustment. I've basically added in 1 centimeter on each shoulder. So I've added in 2 centimeters of width across the shoulders, and we'll see how that goes for me. I am fairly broad-shouldered, quite tall as well. I didn't lengthen it though because I didn't have the fabric, so didn't do any other changes. And so now all that's left to do is set in the sleeves. So on the shoulders, unlike the blue version, this time I did French seams for the shoulders. I've done French seams for the side seams that you can see there, which means everything's encased. It's really nice. And so yeah, all that's left is to sew in the sleeves and then attach the ruffles to the sleeves, which of course is what gives the ruffle sleeve top its name. So I'm going to start with the sleeves. So if you watched me on the previous one of the things I talked about is the fact that, let me grab one of the sleeve pieces here. So this is one of the sleeve pieces. And a sleeve cap, which is the shoulder part here. The interesting thing is it's bigger than the armhole. It is actually bigger than the armhole because you need a little bit of extra, what we call ease. Ease means how much bigger the garment is than you. When we sew something, we don't sew it the exact same dimensions as your body because then it would be skin tight and you wouldn't be able to move. So we build in ease, and ease is how loose or how tight fitting the garment is, and it gives you the ability to actually bend your arms. So a sleeve cap, a shoulder, has quite a bit of ease in it. There's quite a bit of, when you sew, extra material here that kind of almost like puffs out a little bit, and it gives you a little bit of room for the top of your shoulder and for movement. Which is why it's tricky to actually insert one. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to do some gathering stitches across the top of the sleeve cap so that we can just slightly pull it because we need to make sure that the 2 seams are the same length so we can sew them together. So I'm going to do that by sewing a sort of a basting stitch, almost like I'm making a ruffle. You'll see me do this again when I do the ruffles, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew a line along that sleeve cap with a very long stitch. I'm setting my machine as high as it'll go, which is a stitch length of 5. Let me turn just a little bit more so you can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to do that just along the top of the sleeve between the notches that I sewed. I'm going to do it at about 1/4 of an inch. And actually I'm going to do it at 3/8 of an inch. There's a method to my madness. I'm going to do it at 3/8 of an inch. And I'm just going to do it between the notches, and I'm not going to secure it at the ends because I want to be able to pull it and gather it up a little bit. So I'm going to do that now. If you have any questions, please just put them in the chat and I will hopefully see them and respond to them. But otherwise, I am going to sew those ruffles now. So 3/8 of an inch means it needs to stick out slightly past the edge of my presser foot. That's right. Okay. needle down, and don't want to go too fast here. And I've put red thread into the machine for this one. I mean, it's the closest enough match I've got to this fabric. It's pretty close. You don't see it too much. I mean, around the neckline where I sewed down, I made my own. That was the other thing I did yesterday is I made continuous bias binding to bind the neck. And you can't really see. I mean, you can see the red, but it matches pretty closely in there. So it's a red thread that I'm using today. Okay, and I'm not going to secure that end. I'm just going to leave a long tail. So nice long tail, and I need my scissors. Okay. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other sleeve. Just go ahead and do both at once. So as I mentioned, this pattern is called the ruffle sleeve top. It's a free pattern you can get at Peppermint Magazine, which is an online magazine sewing. Well, it's an online sort of sustainability magazine. But if you look up Peppermint Mag and in their menu find sewing patterns, it is a free pattern on there. It's by an Australian designer called In the Folds. And it's a nice little basic blouse, no closures or anything. It just slips over the head. And the distinguishing characteristic is, of course, the ruffles on the sleeves, which is pretty much one of the last things that we do. So, okay, there's another gathering ruffle. So I'm going to cut that off. Cool. All right. I'm going to set my machine back down to normal stitch length, 2.4. And first thing I'm going to do is sew the actual short ends of the sleeves together. I'm going to go ahead and make the sleeve tube. So I'm going to fold it together and sew the armpit edges together, I guess. Really, it's sort of this bit. But I'm going to do French seams. And as I mentioned, that is a nice finishing technique where all the raw edges are encased. It's not that hard, actually. It's a lot easier to do on a straight seam like this than it is to do on a curved one. But we are going to do it on the sleeves anyway. But it's a lot easier to do on this. And so the way I'm going to do it is it's sort of counterintuitive. I'm actually folding the wrong sides together. Normally when you sew a seam, you put right side to right side, right? Well, we're actually going to start by doing it wrong side to wrong side. And I don't even need to pin it because this is just a straight seam. And I'm going to sew this at 1/4 inch. Now this garment is using really 1/2 inch seam allowance throughout, but I'm actually going to do a 1/4 inch here. So I'm just going to sew down the seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll do a couple stitches. I'll back up to lock in the threads. And then, whoops. Oh, hang on. I knew that was going to happen. I sort of ate it. Yeah, I went over it. This happens sometimes. I shoot it up. Let me just get my seam ripper and fix that because that's going to drive me crazy. There it is. It's because I had cut a notch there at the armhole and it kind of got caught in the machine a little bit and munged up. So I'm just going to fix it. Start that seam over again. Oh, and I should get my iron going. Just one sec. Get the iron on. And okay. And you can see what I did. I just sort of accidentally chewed up. When I went backwards, I got a little too close to the edge. And look, I could have probably kept going and it would just been a little bit munged there right at the edge, but I'm going to fix it. This is the nice fabric. Even with, this machine's fairly new. I mean, I only bought it last Christmas, and it's very nice, but every now and then, any machine, I think you get a little too close to the edge and you run the risk that it will chew it up a little bit. And so I'm just going to iron that flat again. Have my ironing board set up right behind my desk. Okay, let's try that again. So again, French seam, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and this time we're going to try and not chew the hell up. Chew the hell out of the edge of the fabric. Don't go too close to the edge, Kris. Okay, we're going to go back 1. Okay, and now going forward. There we go. That's better. Okay, and now my machine has this cool little button with the scissors on it, which sucks both ends to one side and cuts it off, which is really nice. And then I'll just trim the other end. I'm a stickler for trimming my seam ends. Cool, cool. All right, so we have a 1/4 inch seam sewn there. Now what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to trim that seam allowance down to just a couple of mil. So I'm going to take my scissors. Well, first I'll take my scissors. And I'm going to cut it down about halfway. Again, this was wrong side to wrong side. And I'm just going to trim that down to about 2 to 3 mil. So cut it in half. Now I'm going to go back to the iron. I'm going to iron that seam to set it. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of an iron. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn the sleeve inside out again. So I'm going to turn it inside out. And because what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold that seam again and enclose the raw edges in there. So actually, before I turn it inside out, let me go back. And I'm going to iron it to one side because that'll help me get a nice crisp fold in it. So I'm laying it flat, if you can see. So there's the seam down the middle. And I'm just going to use my iron to iron that seam to one side. And I'm actually going to iron it towards the back, which is the side with double notch. I actually need to iron it the other direction. Iron it towards the back. Your sleeve cap will always have some notches on it to help you make sure, because they're not symmetrical. That's one thing. A sleeve cap is not symmetrical. It's slightly asymmetrical, and so there will be some notches on the pattern, and usually 2 notches signifies the back half, and 1 notch will be on the front side. All right, so I've folded that, so I've ironed that down towards the back, and now if I turn it inside out, and now I can put a really crisp fold along that seam that I just sewed, and I can use my iron to iron it as well. So I'm just gonna iron that down right along that seam I just sewed. Perfect. And so now I'm actually going to sew that seam again. And this time I'm going to sew, so now I've got the right sides together. So this is the inside of the sleeve. And I'm going to sew and encase that now. So if I sew down that folded seam line, I will actually trap those raw edges inside. So needle down. And again, do a couple stitches, reverse a few. And now we have a beautiful French seam where everything is actually encased in this little tube. I don't have any raw edges of fabric showing. Perfect. That's one done. Get ready to do the other one. All right, so the other sleeve is here. So we did those gathering stitches across the top. So again, to do the French seam for the underarms, we're going to sew the underarm seam together. You can see the selvage edge there. I mean, I'm telling you, I eked out every possible bit of meterage on this fabric. My mom's messaging me. I'll just tell her she can watch. So again, French seam, I'm going to sew right side, I'm going to sew wrong side to wrong side, remember? And maybe I'll just put a little pin in it just to keep it from shifting. So wrong side to wrong side, which seems counterintuitive, but again, it's only because we're doing this as a French seam. Because we sew it first on one side and then we flip it over and we sew it on the other side. So that's how we're going to end up with all the raw edges encased inside. So again, I'm sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this because when we sew it twice, 1/4 inch plus 1/4 inch gives us 1/2 inch overall. And again, it wanted to eat the little bit at the top. Didn't do it as badly this time. Still not quite used to the intricacies of this machine. And done. Okay, so there's our 1/4 inch seam for the underarm. And so again, I'm going to trim that down. I mean, look, I'm doing a 1/4 inch and a 1/4 inch. So technically it would fit, but because we want to encase it and we don't want it to be too bulky, I'm just going to trim it down to halfway. So I'm just going to use my scissors and I'm going to trim that seam allowance just a couple of millimeters, 2 or 3 mils, so about halfway. Just a very thin little strip. There it is, okay? And then back to the iron. So I'm going to set the seam by ironing it first. Then I'm going to open that sleeve up as I did before. I'm going to press it towards the back. So that this time, because remember they're mirror images of each other, the two sleeves, that means away from me. So I'm going to now iron that little seam allowance, baby seam allowance, over to one side, just to make sure I've got the seam nice and open. I have water in my iron today. What a difference that makes. Now I turn it inside out, and I'm going to fold it on that. See, there's that line, the seam line that we've just sewed. So I'm actually going to fold it on that line. And that's now going to trap all of those raw edges inside. And I'm just going to give that a little bit of a press. And cool. And back to the sewing machine. And now I'm just going to sew that again with a 1/4 inch seam. And that gives us 1/2 inch overall. And again, for those who are watching, if you have any comments, feel free to put them in the text chat. Okay, sew a couple stitches, go back a couple stitches. Okay, and that is our second French seam done. So there it is, and as you can see, all of the raw edges are completely encased in this folded up bit on the inside. It's so nice and neat. If you look at like a men's dress shirt, a professionally made one, look inside, that's how it's going to look. It's going to have these French seams inside. All right, we are now ready to set in the sleeve. So this is where things get fun, and this is where I'm going to use a gazillion pins. So, okay, I'm going to take the shirt, and this is where I need to really sort of think for a moment, because we're going to be doing this, again, French seam, which means I need to start by sewing it wrong side to wrong side. Right. So I'm going to take the sleeve that I've just done and insert it, and I need to make sure I've got the right one, because I need to make sure I've got the one that matches. So I'm going to insert it into it so it's wrong side to wrong side. That's correct. And I just want to make sure that this is the front correct sleeve. Yes, it is. Okay, so I got the right one. So what I'm going to do before I insert it, though, is I'm going to take those basting threads that we sewed. Remember, we sewed that long stitch length basting thread around the top. And I'm just going to take those threads, just the top thread on both ends, and I'm just going to pull. I'm going to start pulling. I'm going to do it from both ends. And I'm going to sort of ruffle it up. Don't worry, it's not going to actually be ruffled. I'm just going to put some ruffles in it for now, okay? So I've put some ruffles in the top of the sleeve cap. It's not going to look like that when I sew it in, I swear. But for now, that's what I'm doing. All right, and now I'm going to insert this into the armhole. So insert into the armhole, and I am pinning wrong side to wrong side. That's right. And I want to start lining up the notches. So my sleeve cap here had notches at the center and front and back, as does my body and so of the garment. And so I'm going to start by doing that. So I'm going to line up the center first. So my center notch, I'm going to line up with that French seam at the shoulder. So I'm going to start by just putting a pin in that. Then I'm going to rotate it slightly and find the notch on the front side and not match that up to the notch on the front, which is where are you, notch? I'm missing a notch. Arg, hang on. How am I missing a notch? Is that it? This always happens to me. I'm just going to grab, oh, it's Mom. Hi, Mom. Yeah, how do I keep it from eating up the fabric? You can either start on a small scrap fabric, or you can use a straight stitch needle plate if available for your machine. I do have that. Is that what I have? I have that. Is that what that is? Is that a straight stitch needle plate? No, it looks like the one I already have. I don't quite, oh, hang on. I think there's also, is there another one as well? I feel like this machine came with like heaps of things, and I don't know what they all are. Yeah, I have that, but it looks, oh yeah, the only difference is the number of holes under the feed dogs. I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, let me grab the pattern piece so I can fix that notch. Don't know. Every time I sew something, I find I forget a notch somewhere. So all I'm going to do is just line up the pattern piece and see where it was meant to be. So the back notches are on there just fine. It's just the front ones that somehow I missed. J plus C plus M. Oh, that's nice. Mom says it's a small hole. Yes, so I think that's what that plate is. Should I swap it out? I don't even know how to do that. I'll do that at a different time because I don't even know how to swap it out. My faceplate. Okay, that's a good tip though. Thanks, Mom. I will try that out in the future. I'm just going to go ahead and so that's where my knot should be. Just going to go ahead and make a small snip. Okay, one notch. Let me just check the other side because if I failed on one side, no, I haven't on the other side. How did I must have only cut through one of the two pieces, like one of the folds instead of both of the folds. Oh well. Okay. Back to setting in the sleeve. Okay, again. So we've got our ruffled up sleeve cap, and since we're doing French seams, we're doing wrong side to wrong side. And I'm going to sew it with the sleeve cap on the top as I'm sewing because that way I can make sure it's lying nice and flat. So I'm going to pin it sort of on the inside here. All right, so like I said, starting at the center, which goes with the shoulder seam, and I will not only pin it at that point, I'm also going to pin it so that the French seam is captured and lies towards the back. I want it to stay folded down nice and flat. Okay, now back around to where the notch is, match my front notches, which I now have. Great, cool. Pin there. And the underarm seam, obviously easy to match up, and both of those seams should be folded, French seam should be folded towards the back. Okay. And, oh, I've got a few more people watching. For those of you who's just joined, my name is Kris, and I am sewing the ruffle sleeve top, which is a free pattern from an Aussie designer called In the Folds. It's available on Peppermint Magazine, which is an online magazine. So if you Google for Peppermint Magazine and then look for the sewing patterns in their menu, you can find it. It's a simple blouse, no closures or anything, and it's got sort of sleeves that come down a little ways and then a long ruffle. So I did a practice version last week, which you can see on my Instagram or on the previous streams that I did, and it worked out really well. And so that was my practice version. This is my fancy fabric. This is Liberty Tana Lawn, which is fairly expensive. And so now that I've worked out sort of the fitting issues and everything and how the French seams and all that worked, now I'm doing the real version. Okay, so we've pinned it in at the four points. Along the bottom of the armpit, there's no gathering. It's a 1-to-1 match, so I can just pin that. So I'm just going to put some pins in along that edge now. And I am an over pinner when it comes to setting in sleeves, so I'm going to use a ton of pins. So if you're wondering why the hell I'm pinning wrong side to wrong side, it's because this garment uses French seams, which is a technique where you enclose the raw edges. It's the sort of seam you see inside a men's nice dress shirt. And it's actually not that hard to do. It looks trickier than it is. Oops, keep catching. I'm trying to not poke too many holes in my nice fabric. So again, I'm just going to pin around the underarm area and use heaps of pins. Okay, so now around the top of the shoulder is that area where I have to ease it in. So that's the area that I've ruffled up, you can see. And the reason I've ruffled it is because, so on the back side here is the armhole, and on the ruffly bit is the sleeve. And so what I'll need to do now is, now that I've got that excess material, I'm just going to spread it out until they're the same length. You know, I want to make sure that they match up when I sew them. And I don't want it to be, trust me, it won't be too ruffly, but what you want to do is you want to kind of spread those gathers out. You don't want it to actually be a ruffle. So when you spread it out, and trust me, you won't see it when you sew it, but you kind of spread it out evenly, and then I can go ahead and pin. And if it seems like a slightly, you know, winging it kind of, it'll look good. Trust me. It seems odd to sew two curves together with of different lengths, and if you need to, you can pull on that thread just to, like I said, shorten one side, shorten the sleeve side up a little bit. And again, you want to distribute those gathers as well as you can. So, and this is the part where I'm really going to overpin it, because you don't really want to have your shoulder, like I'm not aiming for a puffy shoulder, like I don't want it to ruffle, and it won't. It's not that big of a dip. Like if you want to do that, you really want your sleeve to be a lot bigger, the sleeve cap a lot bigger than the opening that you have. We're just doing this for a little bit of ease, to like I said, give it a little bit of movement so that you can swing your arm freely. That's why the sleeve cap is bigger than the armhole. But I'm just kind of distributing, you know, so it's not really ruffled. It's just a little bumpy. Just kind of distributing those gathers. And then I'm just going to do a quadrant at a time and make sure they're nicely distributed so that when we sew, we're not going to have like one area be poofy and another area be completely flat. You want it to be kind of distributed. And I'm sorry to the person who's sewing, because my voice is probably not helping, or who's coding. I'm sure having me talk isn't helping you code. I wanted to have music. I saw some other streams that have music. Twitch has this thing called Twitch Soundtrack, but it appears to only be for Windows 10, and I'm using a Mac, so I can't play music at the moment. But that would be a thing that I'd like to do in the future. So again, on the back half of the armhole, I'm just distributing those gathers evenly. I sort of put a pin halfway along, halfway, and then just make sure I'm kind of, no bit is rufflier than any other bit. And it's going to be slow going because I've put in so many pins, but I really only want to sew these sleeves. I do not want to have to pull these sleeves apart and redo it. And just to triple check, I am pinning wrong side to wrong side. That's correct. I'm sure there are people who can sit in a sleeve without using any pins at all. I am not one of those people. Cool. All right, we have a sleeve pinned in. Lots of pins all the way along. Hey, Wobin's here. Yeah, Wobin, how are you going? Wobin the Weaver, folks. Wobin's trying to get me to buy a loom, and so far he's failing, but temptation is there. Okay, so I'm going to sew this sucker in. I'm going to start at the underarm, and I'm going to sew very slowly. I'm going to take each pin out as I come to it, and I'm going to be sewing it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, this is how we're doing the French seam. This garment, this designer, every pattern you do, you need to find out what sort of seam allowance the designer has indicated. This pattern is actually a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but since they're French seams, you actually sew each seam twice with a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to start, as I said, at the underarm, and I'm sewing sort of on the inside because I want to be able to see the sleeve cap ruffles as I go. I'm going to get all of this under my presser foot, and here we go. Needles down. Okay, and we're going to be sewing again, 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to go very slowly, and I'm going to make sure as I go that I'm not catching any other part of the garment underneath the presser foot, just a little bit at a time with a 1/4 inch. So, and I'm on normal stitch length, and I'm just going to do a couple stitches, lock it in. Okay, here we go. Triple, triple, triple checked, wrong sides to wrong side. That's correct. Okay, I'm coming up to the start of the gathered bit, the start of the eased in shoulder portion. So I'm going to be sewing over these gathers, which is not a problem, but I just want to make sure they're evenly distributed, and I'm not sewing sort of any big folds into the fabric, you know, they're just sort of gentle gathers. We don't sew over pins. We don't sew over pins. I know Mom does, but you're not supposed to. You can break your needle, you can break a pin, it can go in your eye. Safer to not do it. So I'm just going around the top of the shoulder now, bit at a time, making sure everything's flat beneath the needle, or as flat as I can get it, given that I'm sewing 2 different sized curves together. Keep flattening things as I go. I'm using a foot that's got sort of a see-through plastic part on the front, which is very convenient for doing this as well, because you can see that your gathers are not lying nicely. Okay, I'm up to the shoulder. Like I said, I go slow through here, but Mom says she does not sew over pins. Ha! Ha! Well, where did I learn it? I don't know. If anything, it will blunt I think it'll blunt your sewing needle if you hit it, and I don't want to do that. If anyone has any tricks for knowing like how often you should change, like I know there are books that say you should change your sewing needle every time you start a new project. I don't do that, but then I forget when I last changed it. So if anyone has any good tips or tricks for how to remember or keep track of how often you should change your needle. I mean, I don't sew often enough that I feel like one project would blunt the thing. This is only like the second garment I've done all year. Okay, I am at the end. That's nearly at the end of the ruffled part. So I'm back on the home stretch down towards the armpit now. Everything's still sitting nice. Okay, Last couple of pins and we're back at the beginning. Okay, this bit is the flat bit. The Liberty's really nice to work with. It's a very fine sort of crisp. Oh, Mom says, if the machine tracks stitch count, make note of when you... Well, yeah, that would be great. That'd be like the odometer reading, wouldn't it? I do not believe my machine tracks stitch count. It's not a quilting machine. I think that's sort of a feature of the fancy quilting machines, isn't it? But yeah, that would be... I've actually thought of, and I might still do it, of building, hit mute on it, of building an Alexa skill, of being able to say, Alexa, I'm changing the needle, and say which needle it is, and then have it actually be able to tell me. But as of yet, I have not built that skill, but I should do it. I should do it, huh? People would be interested in that. Okay, I'm back around to the beginning, so I'm just going to finish this seam off. Okay, go back a little bit, and then cut. Okay, we have set in a sleeve. So I'm just going to have a quick look, and it looks pretty good. I don't have any areas that are too budged up. So I'm actually going to go ahead now and pull out my basting stitch, just because I don't want to sew over it and leave it in. I'm just going to go ahead and pull that basting stitch out. Just for the sake of not having it in our way as we do the French seam. Cool. Cool. Oh, it's on the inside. That's where it is. Like, where's the other end of the thread? There it is. All right, so I'm going to give that a bit of a press. Trim up my ends. I'm such a stickler for trimming up my thread ends. Okay, back to the iron. And I do have, I'm tethered here with my, let me turn my headphones that way. I have a sleeve roll, which is a tool, one of the sort of specialized ironing tools. The other one there is a tailor's ham. But you can buy this in a sewing shop, and it's for ironing sleeves. Can come in very handy when you're ironing stuff that's unusual shapes. And you can see one side is wool and one side is cotton. So I've got the cotton side. So I can actually, I could probably just use the tailor's ham for this. Why don't I pull the iron a little closer, and then I won't clothesline myself. So I'm just gonna sort of iron that seam a little bit, just to sort of set it in and flatten it a bit, because the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna do the rest of the French seam. We're gonna fold it over on the other side. So I'm just kind of setting the seam, just flatten it out, make it nice. Bit around the armpit. And then I'm going to trim it down. So remember, we've sewn a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm actually going to trim that down by about half. So if I get my scissors now, come back over here. So we've done a 1/2 inch all the way around that edge, and I'm going to cut that down to a 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to use my scissors, and I'm going to trim that down. And I am cutting being very careful not to cut into my sleeve or into my garment fabric, because trust me, you can put a hole in your garment fabric and you will cry. So I should tell you, last night when I was sewing the shoulder seams on this, and I was doing the French seams, I sewed one of the shoulders. I got up to this point, I started trimming it, and I suddenly realized that I had sewn one right side to one wrong side. And I yelled so loud that Rod heard me downstairs. And I had to very carefully unpick it, very carefully re-sew it and try and line it up, even though I had then was down to about 1/8 of an inch of a seam allowance there on that first seam, which wasn't fun, but I managed to fix it, which is why I am now triple checking whenever I do the French seams, because it's very easy to sew it the wrong way. I'm just very carefully trimming this down. You don't want to cut into your seam at all, as well, God forbid, that would also be bad. Just doing a little bit at a time. And I'm back around to where I started. Okay, so I've cut that seam allowance down to about half. So if I now pull the sleeve out, you'll see what we've got. We've got a garment with a sleeve with a seam on the outside, which, you'd think is wrong, but is actually correct for what we're doing right now. So I'm now going to iron this, and I'm going to iron that towards the sleeve. So I'm going to iron it and push that little seam allowance down towards the sleeve all the way around. So back to here, and I actually think I can just do that on the end of the ironing board. Yeah, I'll just use the end of the ironing board. I'm just going to push that seam towards the sleeve. You'll notice I'm doing one sleeve start to finish. I don't assembly line these because I will screw up a French seam, so I'm doing one at a time. Okay. And for the armpit, I will use the tailor's ham. I'm using the white side because that's the cotton side. Reflects the heat a little bit better. Okay. Now, turn the whole thing inside out. And, except I want to keep the sleeve pushed inside because what I'm going to do now is fold it. I'm going to fold it on that seam that we just sewed. So if I pull, hang on. Here we go. Pull the sleeve inside, and I'm going to fold it all along that seam that we just sewed. So here it is. This is the inside of the shirt now. I've got the sleeve tucked down inside, and so that seam line that we just sewed is going to be the fold line that we fold for this French seam. So I'm just going to start at the underarm again. Not going to use quite so many pins this time, but I'm still going to use a fair few. And again, I'm going to sew it on the inside. So I'll put the pins on the inside. So I want to be able to see how it's sitting. I'm just going to go along and fold it. Fold it on that seam that we just sewed. So that is the turn line. And then we're going to sew another 1/4 inch seam. And that is going to trap that little raw edge that we cut right inside. So it's going to be completely trapped. It's not going to show at all. Gonna look professional. So just keep going around that seam and making sure that seam is the fold line that we're folding it on. And then I'm just pinning it. There's the top of the shoulder. Oh, I'm going to jinx it, but this one is going so much faster than the blue one did. Don't jinx it. Don't jinx it. Okay, again, I'm not using quite so many pins on this one. So again, just making sure that that seam that we sewed is the fold line and pinning it all the way around. Put 1 or 2 more pins and we're ready to go. Okay. All right, so ready to sew that. So again, I'm going to start and finish at the underarm just in case if I do, you want to hide the point where you're starting and stopping. And again, we'll do a 1/4 inch seam. So a 1/4 inch, and then we flipped it, and a 1/4 inch gives us 1/2 inch all up, which is the seam allowance that we want. So if you don't want to do French seams, you don't have to. You could just finish the raw edges with a zigzag or with an overlocker if you have it, and then just sew it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You could do that. It'll look a little bit more homemade on the inside. That's not a big problem, but I think the French seams are not that hard, and they're worth doing. So sew a couple stitches. Okay, now we go around the armhole again. I mean, look, it does take longer, like I am sewing each armhole, every seam effectively twice. Small price to pay for tailoring, darling. Again, just making sure that the seam line is the fold. And now I'm coming around the top of the shoulder, which means, again, that there's a little more material on the sleeve cap side than there is on the shirt side, but that's to be expected. It's not actually ruffled or gathered, like you would have thought when you saw that basting stitch that I did. Okay, I'm at the top of the shoulder. Just make sure I'm sewing over my shoulder seam correctly. I am. Oops. The machine didn't want to quite go over the shoulder seam. There we go. Check that. What did it do at the top? Oh, it's fine. It's fine. It's just where that shoulder seam was a bit. I might go back over that bit a second time. Okay, coming down towards the other side of the sleeve. So the first one of these shirts took me about 8 hours all up. But that included sticking the pattern together because it was a printed home PDF pattern. So you got to stick about 25 pages together and then cut it out. And then, yeah, so that added to the time, though I didn't have to do that for the second one. But making your own bias binding adds some time to the process as well. If you don't do that, if you don't do the French seams, you could probably knock one in. I mean, this is not a very, it's only, what, front, back, 2 sleeves and 2 ruffles, 6 pattern pieces. It's not a super elaborate garment. Okay, now I'm just going over the side seams, underarm seam rather, and I'm back at the beginning, so I'll just finish that off. I just want to look at the top of the shoulder. So where I went over the shoulder seam at the top, my needle just jogged a little bit, so I might just re-sew, just sew over that top a tiny bit, just because where I went over the shoulder seam, it's not quite a perfectly straight line. And I feel like at the top of the shoulder you might notice that. So I'm just going to fix it. I don't have to unpick it. I'm just going to sew over the top of it. I'm going to use my hand on the back side as well to kind of make sure we go over it nice and smooth. There, that's the point where it caught last time. Nice and smooth. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's better. Just trim up my threads. And we have a completed set-in sleeve with a French seam. Wait till you see this sucker. Okay. So if I hold it up now, you can see. So that is our completed armhole seam. And look, all of the raw edge, if I turn the whole thing inside out now, turn the garment properly inside out, all of the raw edges are caught up in that folded over seam. They're not shown at all. So now we can go ahead and give the garment a nice press, but we are done with this sleeve. We've now got a completed sleeve with a French seam. Just going to again use the edge of the ironing board and press the seam allowance towards the sleeve itself. Front. And the underarm, oh, I lined the underarm seam up really nicely. I'm happy about that. Let's turn it right side out. So here we have the actual shirt on the outside. And as you can see, the sleeve set in there, there's no actual pucker, you know, despite the fact that we had a ruffle, despite the fact that we eased it in. Instead, what you get, and so this is the neckline, so that's the shoulder seam there. You see we've got just a little bit of extra, it accounts for the shoulder. It's not flat, because human bodies aren't flat, they're round. And I'm just going to give it a press on the outside as well. I'll do it on the edge again. Fabric is very thin and light. I mean, it's not really a winter garment, to be honest with you. I'm kind of making this for spring. But lawn is just a really lovely light cotton fabric for dresses and for blouses. And again, I'm pressing the seam allowance towards the sleeve on the inside. Okay, that's one sleeve down, one to go. All right, back to the other sleeve, which is here. Now, if you missed it, to prep the sleeve, we've sewn the underarm with a French seam. So that's the underarm seam is already done with a French seam. And I've run a basting stitch, a really long, longest my machine will go, which is a 5 stitch just around the top of the sleeve cap. And so to start, I'm actually going to pull on the threads, the top thread, and ruffle it up. So by pulling on that basting thread, I'm going to introduce some ruffles into the sleeve cap. Again, I'm going to do that on the other side as well. So we're not going to have a ruffly sleeve, but this is so that we can get some ease, so that extra room so that we can actually move our arms, because we do want to be able to move our arms in this shirt. Okay, time for the million pins again. All right, so shirt towards me, armhole towards me. Okay, and again, I'm going to insert the sleeve so that we are pinning wrong side to wrong side because we're doing French seams. So I'm going to say it about 100 times, and that's so I don't sew it on backwards. Okay, so now we start pinning. So again, I start at the center. I've got a notch, and that matches up with the shoulder seam. So I can pin there. Okay. Put 2 pins just to hold the shoulder seam allowance over the right side. Okay, I'm going to pin that's the notches that line up for the back. Yep. And this is where if you've accidentally cut your sleeves or used the wrong sleeve, you'll notice it doesn't pin in right. Pro tip, when you cut your sleeves, sleeves are not cut on a fold, but you should. Fold the fabric, and then when you cut it, you'll end up with 2 mirror images. If you lay the fabric flat and cut your sleeve pattern and cut 2 of them, you will end up with 2 exactly the same, which is not what you want. So if you want to do it that way, what you need to do is flip the pattern piece when you cut the second one. Trust me, have made that mistake in the past. Sleeves are not symmetrical. They are asymmetrical. Okay, I'm pinning at the underarm. Usually a sleeve will have, I think, a little bit more of a curve at the back. The front of your shoulder is a bit flatter, and usually the back is a little bit more curved. So I'm pinning each of the 4 notches and seams and quadrants. And then again, the underarm, we don't have any easing in the underarm. It's just a 1-to-1 match. So I can just pin that. And the other side of the underarm. But it's the top of the shoulder where you need more material to allow freedom of movement. Oh, thanks, Mom, for the follow. That's nice when your mom follows you on Twitch. Okay, and then now I'm at the ruffly bit. So again, you use the basting thread to pull the sleeve cap to make it shorter so that it matches the armhole. And you want to distribute any sort of, gathers evenly. So I've made it a little too short, so I can lengthen it up a bit. But I want to kind of distribute those gathers, those ruffles evenly. There we go. I mean, you don't really want ruffles. You just want it to be slightly puckered. Julia Childs of Sewing. Yeah, I don't know. I think she, made up recipes. I am not yet. Thank you. That's very kind of you, Digital Mining Collective. I haven't yet done my own designs. I mean, really, sewing is like following a recipe. And some of the cool thing is, if you haven't sewn in a while, a lot of the indie designers these days actually give you, a lot of instruction. In the old days, if you bought a pattern from one of those pattern envelopes like you think of as being a sewing pattern from one of the, big pattern manufacturers, they give you very minimal instructions. It's basically like, here are the pieces, sew it together. And they expect you to know how to do it. With the indie designers now, one of the cool things about buying digital patterns, buying patterns online, is you can get basically a manual that shows you, with illustrations or with photos, exactly how to sew the thing. So this pattern, when you find it on Peppermint Magazine, as I said, it's a free pattern. If you go to Peppermint Magazine and go to the sewing patterns, you can download it. There's two separate files. One is the PDF with the pattern pieces, and the other is actually the instructions. And so they walk you through all the instructions. I think there's a few bits on this one where I've seen patterns that are maybe a little bit more elaborate on the patterns. I would say this one is probably not one, if you've never sewn a garment before, it kind of assumes you know a little bit of what you're doing, but it's still pretty good. There are others that really sort of handhold you through every step. The other cool thing you can do with a lot of online patterns is if you Google the name of the pattern and sew along, you might find a tutorial. You might find a blog where someone has sort of documented every stage of it, or maybe even some Twitch or YouTube videos where you can watch someone doing it in real time, like I am. So, okay, I've done that one side of the armhole, and I'm doing the other side. So again, I'm just going to distribute those gathers evenly across that side of the armhole, and till the lengths match. And then I don't really want any actual gathers or folds. And then pin it in. Yeah, I think it's one of the scary things with, if you're going to a big craft store and buying an old school, one of the big four pattern makers, there's a lot of assumed knowledge of what you know how to do with sewing. Or if you're getting it from a sewing magazine, there's a lot of assumed knowledge. So go to the indie designers because, they will actually walk you through what to do. It's really, especially a beginner pattern. And PDF patterns, oh, so great. I never buy paper patterns anymore. I only buy PDFs. Cool thing is they, a lot of them now come with different sizes. So you can get, where have I've caught the thread somewhere here. This one came with both A4, so to print it out on normal size printer paper, or you can actually get an A0. So they'll include a version of the pattern printed on very giant pattern paper, a single piece. And so if you go to a copy shop, you can print that version out as a single piece, which is nice. It saves you having to stick all the A4 pages together. I've never actually done that, but if you have convenient access to a copy shop with a giant plotter, that would be super handy. The other thing I've been experimenting, I've been thinking about, someone told me about this. about using a projector. And so I went to Facebook, and if you go to Facebook and search for projectors for sewing, there's a Facebook group. And the idea is you either mount a projector on your ceiling, pointed down at your cutting table, or you get what's known as an ultra short throw projector, which doesn't need to be very far away and can project from sort of standing at the side. And you actually project your patterns directly onto your fabric, so you don't even need to have a paper pattern. So I've kind of been thinking about it. I've been keeping an eye on that Facebook group. They have a lot of guidance on what are the good projectors people use. There are some tricks to, like, obviously if you want to manipulate the pattern in some way, like I said, I did a full bust adjustment on the front of this. I did a broad back adjustment. You would have to manipulate the pattern files itself as opposed to manipulating pieces of paper, which means there's a little bit more sort of specialized software you need to know how to do. But there's a really good group. So if you're interested in that at all, go to Facebook and search for projectors for sewing and have a look. The ultra short throw projectors are really expensive, so I've kind of been keeping an eye on eBay and on Facebook Marketplace. I'm renting here in Germany, so I can't really mount anything on the ceiling, but I could do an ultra short throw. So yeah, I'm tempted. All right, so I've finished pinning that in, and as you can see again, I used a zillion pins around the top of the sleeve, not so much around the bottom. And we're now ready to sew this armhole. And again, French seams, so we're going to do 1/4 inch seams, and I'm just going to triple check wrong side to wrong side. That is correct. I'm not going to stuff it up. Okay. Get everything arranged under the needle, starting at the armpit. There we go. Come on. Needle down, pin out. Cool. All right, so I'm going to go around sewing with a 1/4 inch seam around the inside of the armhole. And I'm just going to take my time and make sure everything is nice and flat under the presser foot and under the needle as I go. Obviously, the armpit area is the easy part. It's nice and flat. The fabric matches up exactly. It's when you get to the top of shoulder, things get trickier because we have all that excess material in the sleeve cap to deal with. And thanks to my zillion pins, won't be a problem. Okay, I'm coming up to the zillion pin part. So I'm just going to keep rotating the garment. I'm just going to go nice and slow. I'm going to make sure these gathers are nice and evenly distributed as I sew over them. I'm not sewing over pins. So again, if you have a lot of trouble with the French seams, just do a zigzag around the edge or an overlock and sew it with a 1/2 inch seam and you'll be fine. It just won't look quite as crisp on the inside. So I saw this pattern. I'm not sure how I found out about it. I think someone I follow on Instagram, I must have seen it. I mean, I follow the designer from In the Folds, and maybe I saw it on her Instagram. And so I clicked through the hashtag, because the hashtag is peppermint ruffle sleeve top. It's a really long hashtag if you want to see other people wearing it. But one of the things I do before I sort of decide I want to make a pattern is I want to see what it looks like on, a body shape like mine, because I, like many of you, have fallen in love with the picture on the pattern envelope and then only realized belatedly that it looks terrible on me. So for example, there's this top by Tessuti, which is an Australian fabric store and designer, called the Alice top. And I really like it. It's got sort of a gathered smocked kind of a top. But tellingly, everyone in the photos is quite skinny with a small bust. And because of the way it's smocked, I feel like with a larger bust, it's not going to be flattering. And I cannot find anyone with a large bust wearing it. And so that's why I'm like, I'm going to stick to something that I've seen a person who looks like me wearing and looks good on them. So that's my advice. If you, before you pay $14 or whatever for a pattern, see if you can find anyone online, Google it. There's also a website, Sewing Pattern Review, where, that'll often come up in the search results as well. And just see if you can find someone whose body shape looks a bit more like yours before you invest, because you don't want to invest in a top or a dress that is not going to be flattering. And yeah, I've fallen in love with the photos just because the attractiveness of the model, and then realized I'm never going to look like that. Okay, coming around the other side of the sleeve now. So if you really want a completely custom sewing experience, I will give a plug for free sewing. Freesewing.org is a website and a platform by Justekok, who's a guy in Belgium, something like that. Maybe Denmark, I'm not sure. Antwerp, I can't remember. Somewhere in Europe. I'm going to meet him one of these days. But Just has built this platform. He's a coder as well as a sewer. And so the idea is it's got a range of patterns on it, most of which you would, traditionally think of as more menswear. He is a cis man himself, so they tend to be along that lines. There are an increasing number of, more traditional, what you might call, women's wear on there. But the idea is, instead of you just downloading a pattern, you instead upload all these measurements. You measure yourself for the person you're sewing for, a whole bunch of measurements, and then click a button. And you make some options, some selections for options. Click a button, and it will generate a completely custom PDF for you to your measurements with your specifications. So I've done a couple dress shirts for my husband. He's got longer arms. He likes this kind of cuff, he likes that kind of hem. And so you can completely customize every aspect of it and then generate a pattern and not have to, as I've done with this, piece together, pick a size, try it on, make some adjustments. You might fall between sizes in a ready-to-wear pattern, which means you've got to kind of blend. Maybe you're I think I'm doing size H on this. Maybe you're a size H at the shoulders, but a size K at the hips, and you've got to blend. But if you're doing a completely custom pattern, you don't have to worry about any of that. All right, so I've done the initial sewing in, and it looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and pull out the basting stitch that we did, the sort of ruffling stitch, because we don't really need it anymore. So I can go ahead and just pull that out, and then I don't have to worry about sewing over it. It's a little bit roughly and gathered, but it'll be fine once we finish sewing it in and do the other turn of the French cuff, of the French seam, sorry. All right, so there, if I push the sleeve out, you can see we've got, on the right side of the garment, we've now got this raw seam edge on the front, which is fine. That's what we want for the French seam. We're going to fix that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim it down. So we did 1/4 inch. So that is 1/4 of an inch right there on this arm seam. I'm going to cut it in half. I'm going to trim very carefully with my scissors. Trim that down to about 2 to 3 mil. So I'm going to trim it in half. So I'm just going to start. I'm going to be very careful not to cut into my shirt, not to cut into the seam itself. And I'm just going to go around and I'm just taking off a tiny strip, just cutting that seam allowance down, because what we're going to do is we're going to fold it and we're going to encase it in another 1/4 inch seam. And so I want to trim it down so it fits and it's completely encased in there. Just go around the top of the arm, trimming it down 2 to 3 mil, I guess 1/8 of an inch if you want to use the old language. Give it a nice trim. Okay, I'm at the underarm. It's a bit thicker there because it's where the underarm seam and the body seam meet each other. This has French seams throughout. So when you turn it inside out, when I'm done, it's going to look all professionally finished inside. There's not going to be any raw edges showing, which is nice. Okay, back to the beginning. So I've trimmed all that down halfway to 2 or 3 mil. I'm going to go to the iron now. It's conveniently right behind me. And so the shirt is the right side out, and I'm going to be ironing that little seam allowance. I'm going to iron it towards the sleeve itself. So I'm going to iron it and sort of push it away from the shirt. Iron it flat towards the sleeve. And I'm setting the stitches. I'm helping the fabric, the two curves just sort of sit really nicely together. You know, and with a bit of steam, you can sort of manipulate this fabric a bit, the seams. So if they're not sitting just right, you can often just fix it through the pressing. I don't mean ironing, I mean pressing. If I were using, I probably should be using a pressing cloth. I'm not, but sometimes you see if you're using a really nice fabric, they'll recommend you use a pressing cloth, which is like a bit of gauze or something you actually iron on top of that rather than ironing onto your fabric directly, just so you don't burn or scorch your fashion fabric. But I should get a piece. I don't actually have a pressing cloth. I should get one. That's one of the only sort of bits I need that I don't have. Sometimes I'll iron on a tea towel if I need to. Just do around the underarm a little bit. Okay. Now I'm going to turn the shirt inside out, but I'm going to leave the sleeve poked in. So I've turned, I'm getting tangled up my headphone cord. So I've turned the shirt, where am I? Turn the shirt inside out, but I've left the sleeve poked in, because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fold it on that seam line that we've just sewn, and I'm going to now pin it, and then we're going to sew around that armhole again, this time right side to right side on the inside, and this is our French seam. This is how we're going to capture all of those raw edges and in that nice little casing, and they're not going to show. So I'm just going to put a few pins now. So just that seam that we sewed is going to be the fold line, really, that we're folding on. Just going to go right around. In a couple of places, I can actually see my stay stitching. So if you didn't, if you saw on the blue shirt, you wouldn't have seen it because I wasn't streaming yesterday when I did it. But as soon as I cut out the pieces for this garment, I actually stay stitched around the neckline and armholes. And that's a technique, because when you cut a woven fabric straight, it's fine. It won't stretch out. But you know, if you pull it at 90 degrees. But wherever you cut a piece of woven fabric on a curve, it will have a tendency to want to stretch out on you. And so by stay stitching, what you're doing is you just run a line of stitching. I did it about, I think, 1/4 inch along the inside of the curves, and you try not to stretch the fabric as you do it. And it's just going to help keep it from stretching out as you're moving the fabric around, because just sort of as you're moving it around your workspace, you can actually stretch the armhole and the neck hole out. And so stay stitching will help with that. And so because I did it at 1/4 inch and we sewed around the armhole at 1/4 inch, I can actually see a little bit of my stay stitching occasionally poking through right at this fold that I'm doing, which was also at 1/4 inch. But it's on the inside, so that's absolutely fine. Okay. Just making sure that fold is the edge, what we've done. Okay, so I've got my pins all the way around the armhole now, and I'm just going to sew that again. Sew the armhole seam again with a 1/4 inch seam, and this will be finishing our French seam. So again, I'm going to start and finish at the armpit. Okay, here we go. Don't stab yourself, Kris. Just making sure it sits nice and flat under the presser foot, and that I'm turning like that seam line is the fold. We want to make sure that that seam line that we've already sewed is the fold that we're turning the edge on. Okay. Sewing curves is always an adventure. That's why men's shirts, I mean, look, men's shirts still, you have to set in a sleeve. You still have some curves. But you don't have darts and things like that. Tend to be straight up and down. Okay, now I'm going around the top of the shoulder. And really, as I'm going around, I'm just making sure that, like, I'm not sewing across any, like, little folds or ruffles or gathers. It should always sit flat under the needle if you've done this correctly. And I'm going to be careful as I go around the top of the shoulder because I had trouble on the last one. So I'm going over quite a lot of folds of fabric at once. So I'll just help it along a little bit. Nice and easy. Okay. And again, I'm sewing on the inside. What I mean by that is the side with more material is on top so that I can smooth it out. It's not on the bottom side where I can't see. You know, if I sewed it the opposite way, you know, I run the risk of sewing a gather or I want to make sure that the tricky bit, the bit with the excess material is on the side that I'm looking at so I can make any adjustments as I go if needed. Okay. Down towards the armpit now. Last pin. Just make sure I'm sewing over that side and armpit seam. Just give it a little bit of a help along because it's quite a bulky seam there. Back to the beginning. And cut. And we have a completed French seam armhole. Trim up the thread ends. Let's give it a bit of a look. Looks good. We haven't sewn any gathers or folds into it. So if I pull it out now so you can see on so this is on the inside out, you can see we now have this lovely fold. So there's that shoulder seam, there's the arm seam, and everything is caught up inside. All the raw edges are inside, no raw edges are exposed, and it looks really professional on the inside. So, time to give it in a press. You always iron after you sew. And again, just gonna iron that seam allowance towards the sleeve. Okay, underarm, use the ham for the underarm. Because it looks like a ham. Okay, and turn it to the right side and give it a little press on the right side as well. So well, that's the sleeve we've just done. We've just done the right hand sleeve. Just press it a bit on the outside too. It's a nice set-in sleeve, people. Each one I do, I'm getting a little bit better at. The first one I did, one shirt for Rod, was not great. know what I should do? I should try it on. Give me a second. I'm going to try this on. Okay. Now, obviously, I have it on over a long sleeve t-shirt here just because it's cold. But, okay, we have the basic shirt. All that's left are the sleeve ruffles to add those on. So last step, and then we hem it, and it's done. But I'm happy with the fit. So as I said, I did a broad back adjustment, which means when I bring my arms forward, it's still a little tight across the back. It's not as tight as the blue one was across the back. I think because I'm tall and I have a tendency to hunch a little bit, it means I'm a bit broader across the shoulders. I have wide shoulders as well. So maybe if I do it again, I might even add a little bit more in. That probably means I'll need to do a dart on the back. I pushed this one, I did a centimeter broad back because that's about as much as you can do without having to add in a back dart on the shoulder seams. But I'm really happy with the fabric. It's so nice. It's a good color too. Okay, sleeve ruffles. Let me take this off. Okay, ready to do the actual sleeve ruffles, which is kind of the defining characteristic of this shirt. It is called the ruffle sleeve top. So the last two pattern pieces that I have, oh, and look, if I turn it inside out, you can see there's the bias binding around the neckline that I did, and I'm really proud of how nice I did at the V-neck there. I did a really good job. So that's the inside. So we're going to go ahead and take, I've got these two long rectangles here. Two really long rectangles, which are going to be ruffled up and used as the ruffles on the sleeves. So this is where I'm going to do it similar to how I did the sleeve cap. So each of these has some notches along one side. Yes, along the top and along the top. Cool. So I'm going to start by sewing, again, a basting thread that I'm going to use to actually gather it up like a ruffle. So this is going to be almost like we're making like curtains, like a proper ruffle here, okay? So really girly stuff. So I'm going to bump my stitch length up to 5. And I'm going to sew this ruffle, this basting stitch, again, 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to sew it just between the notches. So I've got a notch there. Yep, notch. And I'm just going to sew it along the edge with the notches. Uh-oh. What's happened? Did we run out of bobbin thread? Oh, my bobbin thread got a big old tangle. What happened? Must have been when my bobbin thread was wound. It was not happy. Let's pick that apart. Glad it did it now and not on the sleeve. I would have lost it if that happened on the sleeve and I had to unpick it. Curious. Let's just take a look at the bobbin thread and make sure. It's a drop-in bobbin. It's one of the reasons. One second, I'm gonna sneeze. Sorry. Yeah, I bought a machine with a drop-in bobbin with a clear cover so that I can see how much is left, which is really handy. It doesn't look like there's anything. I don't know. Maybe it was just when the bobbin got wound, it had a funny spot in it. But I'll put it back in, and then it goes around that way. Cool. Cover goes back on. Let's try my ruffle again. I don't usually have any bobbin thread tangles on this machine, but give it another. Oh, I know what it was. It wasn't that my bobbin thread was screwed up. It's that my top thread ran out. Literally ran out of thread. And that's good because I was actually using that one up. I have plenty of this red thread, so that's what happened. So I will switch to another one. This is exactly the exact same. I'm using Gutermann, 100% polyester. Its color is that 156. Is that the right one? They have numbers printed on them. Color 156, yeah. So I'm just using up the rest of this thread. And yeah, I ran out. Wow, imagine if I had run out on that sleeve, I would have cried. I'm so glad it ran out on the ruffle. All right, so thread the machine. This machine. I love the fact that this has the horizontal thread as opposed to the vertical one. Just means everything stays nice and self-contained. And then just need to thread the needle. This machine does have, it is a quote-unquote self-threader. Yeah, I'll use the self-threading function. I rarely use it. It's because I use it poorly, and it's easier to just do it yourself. There we go. Okay, machine rethreaded. Sew the ruffle again. Again, I am doing 3/8 of an inch from notch to notch. Needle down, 5 is the length of stitch. Here we go. And again, I'm not finishing it. I'm not cutting it. I'm leaving a long tail here because I want to be able to draw these threads up to ruffle it. So I'll do one, and then I'll do the exact same thing on the other one. I should have 3 notches. Yep, there they are. So this is a basting stitch we're going to use to gather up the ruffles, which are kind of the main style element of this top. Okay, long threads. Cool, cool, cool. Put it back down to my normal stitch length so I don't forget. All right, we're going to sew the ends of the ruffle together, the short ends, before we do anything. So it's almost like we're following the same process we did for the sleeve. French seam means counterintuitive, wrong side to wrong side. See, I have to recite it to myself every single time or I will get it wrong. So wrong side to wrong side. Yay. And okay, I'm gonna live dangerously and not bother pinning it. And 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch is our seam allowance because this is a French seam and we're going to sew 2 seams that will add up to half. So do a couple stitches, go back a couple stitches. Okay, cut. All right, so we've just sewn that short ends together with a 1/4 inch. Trim my threads. And now for the French seam, every time we do the same thing. We cut it down in half. So I'm going to cut that 1/4 inch down to just 2 or 3 mil by trimming that seam allowance in half. So about 1/8 of an inch. Okay. And then iron. That's why it's very convenient to have an iron right next to where you sew so you're not getting up constantly. So iron it flat first just to sort of set the stitches. And then I'm going to open it up and just press it to one side. Doesn't really matter which. Press it to one side. Okay. And now we turn it inside out. And we use that fold, that seam that we've just created. So that seam is there in the middle, and we're going to fold it on that seam. And I'm going to give it a little press as well. And so now when I sew this seam with a 1/4 inch, we're going to encase those raw edges inside. So this is a French seam. You keep hearing me saying it over and over because I'm using it on every seam in this garment. And French seam on the ruffle. So that means on the inside, we now have this little folded seam allowance and all of our raw edges are captured inside. Nice and neat. So, cool. All right, there's one prepped. Do the other one now, short edge to short edge, starting with wrong sides together, wrong sides together. I honestly thought I wasn't, because I had so little of the pink fabric. I was toying, I actually thought when I originally laid out the pieces that I might have to piece the ruffles, that I might not be able to get a piece long enough, that I might have had 2 pieces that I had to sew together. But I managed to just eke it out with only a tiny bit of scraps left of the pink fabric. And still had enough to make the continuous, well, and making the continuous bias binding was the other tricky bit, because, you know, I could have used some store-bought bias binding to go around the neckline and just get something that sort of matched. I didn't have anything to hand in a similar color. I only had like white and blue, which you wouldn't want to use because you'd see it. And so luckily I managed to get about a 10-inch square piece left in one corner. And if you look up continuous bias binding, that was enough to make enough bias binding to go around the neckline. So I was very pleased with that. It's always nice when you finish a project and you've got nothing but scraps left over. Okay, I'm trimming that seam allowance down to just a couple mil, 1/8 of an inch. There it is, back to the ironing board. So I'll press that seam flat to start. Okay. Now we open it up, press it to one side. And I'm kind of like pulling the seam with my hand to kind of like open it up as well. Okay, and now we turn it inside out, and we're actually going to fold it on that seam. So you can see the seam line there down the middle. We're actually going to fold it on that seam line. And just going to give it a little bit of a press. Okay, Cool, and I'm going to sew that. Again, 1/4 inch seam, and that's our French seam complete. Okay, I'm just going to check the instructions for a moment. Make sure I'm not skipping anything. Ah! I did do something wrong, but it's okay. It's easy to fix. The basting stitch that I did around the ruffle here is actually meant to go pretty much the whole way around. It's not meant to only go between, you want the ruffles to be all the way around. There's not an area of no ruffles, so it's okay. I'm just going to redo it. So I'm just going to pull out that basting stitch, and they actually have you do it after you sew the side seam there anyway. I'm just going to pull out that basting thread. Okay. And instead I will resew it. So there's our completed French seam, by the way. Fold it over on the inside, and I'm just trimming up a bit of a frayed thread there. Okay. So instead, I'm going to now sew the ruffle. I'm going to take off the tray on my machine because we're going to be doing around the sleeve, and so I need a narrower circumference to actually work around. I'm going to take that off. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew again. I'm going to go back up to the 5. Do it properly this time. I don't want to sew across my seam, so I'm going to start and end just either side of the seam. So it's not going to be a continuous circle, but it's going to be awfully close. Where's the end of that thread? Where'd you go? Where'd you go? There you are. So just either side of the seam, and again, 3/8 of an inch. Needle down. I was just going to go around now in a continuous, in a loop. Okay, and I don't want to join it up, so I'm going to stop right before the seam and leave a long tail. As mistakes go, that's a pretty painless one, so I don't feel too bad about that. That's okay. I'll just go ahead and fix the other one while I'm at it right now as well. I always make at least one mistake, and so as mistakes go, that one is not a very big one. On the sleeve, you only sew the basting stitch between the notches, but on the ruffle, you go all the way around. Okay. How are we doing on bobbin thread? Still okay. All right, let's try this again. So going from, again, let's make sure I'm sewing it on the side with the notches. Yes, yes. Ah! I did another mistake. Are you kidding me? On the okay. Side with the notches. Third time lucky. Needle down. Okay, this one is definitely going to be correct. This one is going to be correct. Again, don't don't go completely to the seam, go right up to it, stop there, pull, long thread. All right, and back to the first one, because what I've done is I've sewn the basting thread on the wrong side. I've sewn it on this side. It's meant to be on the edge with the notches. Instead of sewn it on the hem side. I have now mucked this up 2 different ways, so let's see if I can actually fix it, do it properly. Okay, pull it out, pull it out, pull out the thread on the back. All right. Side with the notches. With the notches, people. 3/8 of an inch, close to the seam. Here we go. Correct. All right. Long threads. Here we go. Back to normal stitch length because we don't have any more stuff ups. Awesome. Okay. Now, as I did with the sleeve, I'm going to take the 2 top threads there and start creating some ruffles. I'm going to start bunching this thing up. So here we go. I'm making my ruffles, my curtains, as it were. So obviously we need to get this down to be around the same circumference as the sleeve is around. I'm just going to pull it up, bunch it up pretty tight into a ruffle. Okay. Take the shirt, and this is where I'm going to make sure, because I did this wrong on the blue one. I'm going to make sure I'm doing this correctly. I want the shirt inside out. Shirt is inside out, yes. I want sleeve ruffle, because I want to do wrong side to wrong side. So I want sleeve ruffle with the right side on the outside. I'm going to insert it, and now I'm going to pin. Got it. So again, my ruffle has notches all the way around. So I'm just going to use those. I'm going to start at the bottom edge, which is underside of the arm. Okay, and then there should be a notch in the center of the sleeve and the center of the ruffly edge. Yep. And then let's sort of distribute the ruffles around. And then I should have another notch 3/4 or 1/4 of the way around. Where are you, other notch? There it is. So match notch to notch. And I'm pinning on the inside. I should be pinning on the outside. Look, I'll do it, and then I'll flip it around and go on the outside, because I should be pinning on the outside. I want to sew this with the ruffles on top so that I'm looking at the ruffles as I look down at the thing. Okay, and there should be one more notch on this side. There you are. Ruffle notch, sleeve notch. Okay. And now, similar to what we did with the armhole, I'm now going to use a whole bunch of pins, because each of these 4 quadrants I'm going to now need to distribute the ruffle. So I need to make sure that the ruffle edge matches the length of the sleeve. And once I have it the same length, I'm going to kind of try and evenly distribute the ruffles. So again, you don't want one area to be super poofy and the other side to not be poofy. And so this will be more, these are ruffles. This is not easing in a sleeve. You know, when we eased in the sleeve, we didn't end up with any visible ruffles at the end. This time we will. We are going to be sewing across ruffles. So again, I'm going to use a ton of pins because I don't want things moving around on me. Not done a lot of ruffles, to be honest with you. I don't wear a lot of ruffles, and I haven't sewn a lot of ruffles. So this is an unusual pattern for me to have fallen in love with. Just need to tighten up that bit just a little bit. I mean, the sort of tiered ruffled prairie dresses are very much in style at the moment, aren't they? Don't know that I'll be going to that extreme, but ruffles are very much in at the moment. Okay, let's do this part. Let's just open her up. It's always good to start at the top of the shoulder and work your way down. Okay. Or shoulder, it's not the shoulder, it's the top of the arm, I guess. Okay, ruffles, ruffles, ruffles. Okay, that's half done. Now the other half. So, you know, we had that really long rectangle and we're just trying to make it the same, same length as around the arm, which is what the gathering stitches were for. And again, trying to evenly distribute the ruffles all the way around. And last quadrant. Loosened it up a bit too much. You can always retighten it if you need to. Just pull on that basting thread to create. Create a few more ruffles if you need. When in doubt, pin. Okay, back around to the beginning. So now I can sew that. So again, French seam means wrong side to wrong side. Yes, yes. Triple check. Triple check. I'm going to slide this onto the arm. So we're going to be going around the armhole here, and I've got the ruffle side up so that I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to start at the underarm seam, the underside of the arm. Keep these ruffle tails out of the way. And as always with our French seam, we are sewing 1/4 inch seam allowance. Needle down. Okay, nice and slow. Back up a bit. Okay. Now what I'm doing as I go is I want to sort of pull the ruffles, so make sure the ruffles sit vertical. You know, I don't want my ruffles to sort of all fold over like a pleat. So I'm, you know, as I go, I'm just sort of lifting the presser foot as needed. I'm kind of rearranging things. I'm kind of pulling the ruffles down perpendicular to the seam because I don't want them all folding. I mean, they do end up folding, but you know, I just don't want them to look like pleats, basically is what I'm saying. Pulling pins as I go. So many pins. You're just kind of rotating the garment around the arm as you go. I mean, most machines do have a removable tray so that you can have a short, you know, a narrower arm for doing sleeves like this, for doing a sleeve cuff. It's very handy. Okay, more than halfway, I think. You know, you're sewing over quite a bit of fabric on the ruffle side. Remember how much longer the ruffle was than the sleeve. Again, I'm just going to pull things down nice and perpendicular to the seam. Look, I don't think you're really going to notice if your ruffle isn't 100% uniform all the way around. That's kind of the beauty of a ruffle, but you do want it to be, you don't want it to be more ruffly on one side than the other. So much easier to sew ruffles than to knit them. I tell you what, I knitted a sweater with a ruffle at the bottom edge. And when your knitting pattern starts with, you know, cast on 750 stitches, run the other way. It is an absolute nightmare to knit a ruffle. You're either starting with a whole bunch of stitches and decreasing, or you're increasing a ton. Either way, not fun. Or maybe that is your idea for fun. It's not my idea of fun. It's like, so I don't do beaded knitting. Start by stringing 1,000 beads on your thread. No, not going to happen ever. Okay, I'm back around to the beginning. Just this last little bit, last pin. Okay. and join up the stitching lines. There we are. Finish it off. Cool. So we've now got a roughly edge sewn on. So if I turn it, well, you can't really see it now at the moment, but French seam, what are we going to do? We're going to trim it. We're going to flip it. I'm going to pull the basting thread out now because I don't need it anymore. So I'm going to just, what I usually do is cut it on the opposite side, make sure I'm cutting the right thread, and then just go ahead and pull the tail, and it should. Oh, except it broke, but that's okay. Just go ahead and feed it through. I don't want to create too big of a holes in my Liberty. Okay. I mean, look, you can leave the basting thread in. I did on the blue version I sewed last week because it will probably end up in the seam allowance on the inside. But I'm just being extra conscientious by pulling it out this time. I don't want to run the risk of any bit of it showing on the outside. You shouldn't. It should be turned and should be entirely hidden within the seam allowance. But I'm just making sure that none of it even shows where I'm turning the seam on the inside. Okay, and last little bit. There we go. Get that thread out of there. Kind of a stickler for loose threads. Okay. All right, so back to the 1/4-inch seam that we just sewed. Now what we're going to do is, of course, trim that down to half the width. So trim it down to a couple of mils. I'm going to use my sharp scissors. Just trim up that edge. And so I'm just going to very carefully go around this cuff, and I'm going to take that 1/4-inch seam allowance and I'm going to cut it down to just a couple of mil or 1/8 of an inch. And being very careful not to cut into my actual garment or the seam itself. And this is where I drop bits of fabric everywhere. I know there are sewers who don't neaten up their threads as they go. I'm kind of a neat freak when I sew. I really like to keep all the little bits of thread, like tidy up as I go. Okay, and back around to the beginning. So I've trimmed that seam allowance down to just a couple of mil all the way around. And so now, of course, I'm going to give it a press. And this is where the sleeve roll, I'm going to use the sleeve roll now. So that is the skinnier one. So I can actually insert that into the sleeve and press press that way. Actually, again, I can probably use the ham because this is a fairly wide cuff. I can probably use the ham. I'm just setting, I'm ironing that seam, really kind of, we call it setting the stitches. It's just kind of like locking them in place. Locking these lovely ruffles into place. Go all the way around. And then, as with all of our French seams, what we're going to do is we're going to flip it. We're going to flip it so that the ruffle is down inside the sleeve. And so that seam that we just sewed is going to be our turning line. And so we're going to turn it and fold it right on that line. And I'm now going to do a bunch more pins. And again, I'm gonna sew on the inside this time because again, I want to sew with the ruffly part up where I can see it. So, time to pin. And I'm just going to pin all the way around. And using that seam line that we just sewn as the fold. That's on that edge that I'm folding. It's the seam that we've sewn. Obviously, there's a lot more fabric tucked down inside the sleeve because of the ruffle. Okay, that's the bit at the underside of the sleeve. It's fairly thick there because I've got two French seams coming together, so I'm going to need to be very careful when I sew over that part. It's fairly thick. I've got several layers of fabric that I'm going to be punching through. Keep going around. And this is the part I stuffed up on the blue one. I did one of these cuffs, I actually sewed it on, sewed the ruffle on the wrong way, and had to pick it apart and redo it. That added a good half an hour to the blue one, but we have not had that problem on the pink one. I should be able to finish this before dinner. Okay, last little bit. Again, I'm just using that seam line that we've just sewn as the fold, folding it at that point, and I'm just putting some pins so things don't shift too much. Okay, ready to sew the rest of that French seam. And instead of sliding on to the arm this time, like I said, I'm going to actually sew it on the inside. So I'm actually going to put it on top and look down inside like this. And the reason I'm doing that is because that's the ruffly side. And I want to be able to see what these ruffles are doing as I sew. So as you can see there, there's the sleeve. I'm not going around the arm this time. And I'm just going to keep making sure the ruffles are perpendicular. And I'm going to sew around another 1/4 inch seam. Oh, I'm going to need to give it a little bit of help to start because it's very thick. Just peek. Yeah, we still got bobbin thread. We're good. Just don't want to run out halfway around doing a ruffle sleeve French seam. Okay. Again, just keep pulling everything perpendicular to the seam as you go around, 1/4 inch. So I'm kind of arranging it. I'm kind of pulling the ruffle down away from the fold, making sure everything goes perpendicular under the presser foot as it goes under. As you are sewing ruffles in at this point, you should be sewing across some ruffles here as you go. Just kind of using my fingers to keep everything pulled taut. Sometimes you need to lift up the presser foot and arrange things underneath. I'm just taking my time here. As I said, this is the main design feature of the shirt, so I want it to look nice. I'm at the halfway point. Just keep arranging things. Ooh, my back. Get very sore. I need to stop and stretch every now and then. Hunched over. Could probably pull my machine a little closer to me, actually. I'm also, I did buy an IKEA desk, so my desk does go up and down, so I can adjust it to get it at the right height, not have to lean down as much. Okay, last little bit. Don't sew over the pin. It's like a bit with no ruffles. After all that talk about distributing them, I'd like a bit with no ruffles, then a bit with heaps of ruffles. It'll be fine. Best intentions. Keep rearranging things. Okay, nearly back around to the beginning. Okay, I'm just going to use my hands to help pull it on through because I'm quite, as we go over that French seam, there's quite a lot. Come on. Come on. There we go. Quite a lot of material to sew over. Okay. Done. Right. So we now have a French seam on a ruffle. Let me trim those thread ends. Oh, excuse me. And now, if I turn the whole thing right side out, we should hopefully see. Voila, we have a sleeve with a sleeve ruffle. And if I turn it inside out, you'll see all of those raw edges are completely contained in that folded over French seam. Very cute. I will just give it a bit of an iron and oh sure, I'll use this. I'll use the ham. Don't really need the sleeve roll on this. Just put the ham inside. I'm going to press the seam allowance on this one away from the ruffle. I'm going to press the seam allowance up towards the sleeve. Didn't unplug myself, did I? No. Okay. I don't want to like iron my ruffles flat. I'm just going to, oh, I have a thread hanging out there. Let me trim that. But I'm just helping it to sit nicely, that seam. So I don't want to, don't want to totally flatten my ruffles, but I'm really just trying to flatten the seam. There's that. Also, I'll iron the seam allowance for the where we joined the short ends of the ruffle together. Iron that to one side, and again, I'm pressing the seam allowance at the top of the ruffle towards the sleeve, away from the ruffle. Yeah, funny little ruffle spot there. You get funny little folds sometimes on the ruffle. Okay, I think that's pretty much all the way around. So that is one sleeve ruffle complete. Time to do the other side. Gotta do it all again. It's a pain, isn't it? So there's the one sleeve ruffle. Time to do the other side. Okay, back. Here it is. All the way back to here. So we've got the short ends sewn together, and now we're going to grab the long tails of our basting threads and we're going to create the ruffle. So I'm just going to pull it tight and spread the ruffles along. Okay, nice little ruffly bit. Let's turn the ruffle right side out. All right, sleeve. We're going to start with inside out. That's right, inside out. Inside out, Miss Jane. Where's the sleeve we're attaching to? Here it is. All right, so I've got the sleeve we're attaching to, and I'm going to slip the ruffle over the top of that. Wrong side to wrong side. Yep. Wrong side to wrong side. Cool. And then we start pinning. Let's start at the underarm. Underarm is there, underarm is there. So you always start off by pinning the sort of notches, or, I think of them as the 4 quadrants. So where's my sleeve? There's my sleeve, and there's my center notch. Center notch. I really kind of pulled that ruffle super tight, way tighter than it needed to be. Let's loosen it up a bit. Doesn't need to be quite that tight. So I think this lawn, because it's a soft, it's a thinner fabric than the blue shirt that I did, if you saw the other one I made, was a quilting cotton, which is quite, it's a bit stiffer. And so really I was worried it would come out looking like a dust ruffle. The ruffle definitely has a little bit more body to it. I think on this, because of the lawn, because of the thin and lightness of it, I think it's going to drape a bit more. But I'm going to go ahead and start distributing ruffles and pin as I go. You can see the bottom of this sleeve is in fact the selvage edge. That's that peak of white peeking out there. It looks the very edge of the fabric. Like normally you wouldn't cut, right up to that, but that was the only way I could get all the pieces on. And I figured it's gonna be lost in this seam anyway, so it's fine. Distributing Ruffles will be the name of my band's first album. Okay, there's one half done. And go to the other half. And again, start from the furthest point away from your ends so that you can kind of lengthen and shorten along that side as you go. So where's my notch? There's my notch. And there's my notch. Distribute the gathers, Kris, a little better than that. That's better. See, this is the part where it'd be great if I had some music playing, wouldn't it? Okay. Couple couple more pins. Last little bit. Again, distribute the gathers. Distribute the ruffles. Last couple pins. Okay, just triple check. We're sewing wrong side to wrong side. That is correct. All right, pinning is done. We pinned all the way around. I'm now going to slide it onto the arm of the machine. And a lot of threads here from that basting. Just going to slide it on. And we're going to do a 1/4 inch seam all the way around, starting at the underarm there. Where's my foot pedal gone? It's moving away from me, Fezzik. Okay. Needle down. Here we go. 1/4 inch seam. And I'm removing pins as I go. And rearranging things so that all the ruffles sit flat and perpendicular under the needle. Now, if you do want to go back and see the first part of the blue shirt, the other shirt that I made, which shows the first part of this pattern, it is on Twitch there. My previous streams are archived on Twitch for 2 weeks. And then what I do is I actually copy them over, export them to YouTube. So I do have a YouTube channel as well. And if you look me up on YouTube, you can see past streams over there. So if you want to see the first part of this shirt, how I did the darts on the bust, how I did the full bust adjustment, stuck the pattern together, did the full bust adjustment, sewed the shoulder and the side seams together. All of that is over on, it's currently on Twitch still, but it will eventually end up on YouTube. And please subscribe if you want to find out the next time I sew, the next time I knit. I sew, I knit on Twitch. Next one will probably be knitting again. I knit most Sunday mornings. That is my regular Twitch knitting time. Sewing, we're still on holidays, Christmas, New Year's holidays, so took advantage of the time. This is some of the fabric I brought from Australia with me. I got this Liberty, I think, at the fabric store in Surrey Hills in Sydney. Shout out to the fabric store. I think it was when they had their sale on. But yeah, 2 meters is, I guess, bare minimum you would need to do this pattern. And that is Well, and I'm at the larger end of the size scale, so if you were smaller, you might not have it be such a tight fit as I had. But if you're going to do the facings, which the pattern calls for, you want to have even more. You really want to have, I think it recommends like 2.9, like you're going to need quite a bit of meterage to do it. Okay, we're back at the beginning, and I've just got to sew over the seam, so it's just a bit of a help it through the feed dogs there. Okay. And we're done. We are all the way around. Let me trim off all these loose threads. So many loose threads. Actually, some of it is from the ruffle, which I can go ahead and remove now, as I did last time. So I'll go ahead and remove my gathering stitches. So they're below, remember I sewed them at 3/8 of an inch? And since I just sewed that seam at 1/4 of an inch, they run below the seam that I've just sewn. And so when we fold it, they would be, included in the folded over French seam, but I didn't necessarily sew the straightest line, so I don't want to risk any part of it poking through on the outside of the garment. So I'll pull it. Make sure you don't cut the wrong thread. I'm also being very careful with the seam ripper to not cut my fabric. Okay. Tidy up all these loose threads. Pull the other thread from the inside. Yep, got it. Okay. All right. Now what we've got is we've got that 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the ruffle. Trim it down to half that, to a couple mil to 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to just use my scissors and trim that down. Being very careful not to cut into my sleeve, not to cut into my seam. We're doing this because we're going to fold that French seam over and completely enclose this raw edge. And so I'm just trimming it down so that we don't catch it when I sew the second part of the French seam. Nice and slow, just trimming it down. Okay, I think that's all the way around. Yep. So we've just trimmed that a little closer. All right, so we've cut all the way around, and we've cut that seam allowance down to just, I'll stab myself with a seam ripper, down to just a couple mils. Cool. So now we're going to give that a bit of a press, and then we're going to flip it, pin it, and resew the other side of the French seam. Back to the iron, and I'm just going to set the stitches here. Just going to give it a little press on that seam. I'm using my tailor's ham. But you don't have to. You could use the end of the ironing board if you needed. Or a rolled up towel inside just to give it a little bit of a shape. Okay. Pretty good. All right. Now what I'm doing is I'm folding it out, and then I'm going to fold the ruffle down inside the sleeve. So ruffle goes down inside the sleeve, and we're turning on that seam that we just folded. So this turn line here is that seam that we just folded. So I'm going to go ahead and pin it there. Turn it back this way. And time to pin. You can actually see a little bit of the white peeking out. That's actually from that selvage edge. That's that shows you just how I eked out every single usable bit of this fabric. All right, so I start at the underarm seam, and now I just start going around. I'm just folding it on that seam line that we've sewed, and making sure that seam line sits right on the edge. And I put a pin every inch or two, and make sure the ruffles are kind of pointed perpendicular to the seam edge. Again, you've got a fair bit of sleeve, of ruffle tucked down inside the sleeve there. So just go a bit at a time. And if any place wants to sort of bubble up, you just use an extra pin. This is a bit like origami. And then this, other than this, it's just hemming. Hemming, and we're done. I'll be done in time for dinner. I'm cooking tonight. Fajitas. Oh, shoot, I should run down and marinate. I'll probably, I might stop the stream before I do the hem, just so that I can go down and get the chicken marinating. So you might not see me do the hem. But I will put the picture of the finished garment up on my blog, which is web-goddess.org. That is a very old joke that is now my blog name. But I will put the finished item up there so you can see what it ended up looking like. The hem, I'm thinking the bottom edge of the body hem is meant to be 1 centimeter turned up twice, and because I didn't lengthen it at all and I am taller, I might actually do a narrower hem along the bottom edge just so I get a little bit of extra length in the body. So maybe I won't fold it up quite so much. Might do just 1/4 and 1/4, to be honest with you. Okay, just folding it on that seam, distributing the ruffles down, and pinning. I'm a little interested to see how see-through this is, to be honest with you. Like, that would be one advantage to doing the facings, is it would give you a little bit more coverage, because the facings go down most of the front and top of the front and top of the back. So I feel like they would give you a little bit more coverage. Again, I just did bias binding because I didn't have a lot of fabric. So I'm kind of curious to see how see-through this long. I don't think it is. Like, I held it up. You can't really see through it. So I think it'll be fine. But I may end up wearing a singlet underneath it in the summer. You never know. Okay. Oh, my. Let's just stretch for a second here. Hear my neck crack? Sewing is, I don't know, I have terrible ergonomics when I sew. I need someone to come in and be a consultant and just tell me exactly how to set up my machine and my chair and the height and everything. I mean, I did get the height adjustable desk more for cutting, so that when I'm cutting, and what I did when I cut this is I raised it right up so I don't have to hunch over to cut, which is really nice. But for sewing, I'm hunching over a bit. Okay. All right. Again, maybe put a little higher. Go a little higher and see what that does. Okay, again, I'm not going around the arm this time. Instead, I'm sewing on the inside because I want to see what I'm doing. And I'm starting at the underarm and just, goodness. Let's fix that pin there. And as always here, we're going to be doing 1/4 inch seam to finish the French seam. Okay. Final ruffle top seam. Let's go. I think I'm going to have just enough bobbin thread too. It's a tiny bit left. Okay. Distribute these ruffles, make sure they're folded straight down from the seam. You don't want my ruffles to like twist around the arm. Okay. Ah, my thread broke. I'm like, wait, what is happening here? What just made that sound? My thread broke. Damn it. Okay, only broke a few inches back, so that's good. I didn't sew too far. But it's annoying, is what it is. All right, I wonder why that happened. I must have either a weak spot or it looks like maybe, I'm not sure. Thread just broke. Sometimes threads break. Rethread the needle. Rethread the machine. And cool, we're back in business. And I only lost like an inch or two there, so that's fine. I don't need to repin. I can just put it back under the needle. And I'll just sew over that last centimeter or so to kind of lock that loose thread in. And I'll reverse a little bit. Okay, there we go. Well, we ran out of thread, we've had thread break. I sewed basting thread in the wrong place twice. Okay, almost done. And I gotta go marinate some chicken. Okay, back to the beginning, and again, I'm just going to go slow because I got to go over the French seams, and there's quite a bit of fabric there, so I'm just going to help it through under the presser foot by pulling a bit and pushing a bit. Come on. There we go. Even with this machine, which has a fair bit of grunt, when you're sewing across like 6 layers of fabric, it's hard to get through the machine. Okay, cut. And our French seam is sewn. Let's cut off the ends. And that's where the thread broke. And so trim off those ends as well. Okay. And now there's a slightly wonky bit at the start. Let's see what it looks like if I turn it right side out. Sleeve ruffle. A bit of fluff there. Okay, looks good. We're good. All right, final press. Again, I'm going to use the tailor's ham to press the ruffle cuffs, and I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the sleeve, so up away from the ruffle. A couple of these white threads, which are from that selvage edge that's frayed a bit underneath. So I'm just going to very gently trim them. I'm not really pressing, I don't want to press my ruffles flat. I just want to really just press the seam and press the seam allowance up, just so that it actually makes them stand out a little bit more. Okay, and there's the where we joined the short edges. I'll just make sure that seam is sitting nicely down. Again, press everything away from the ruffle. Got a little bit of the fuzz coming through there. Okay. Seeing a few of the white threads poke through. I'm just getting rid of them as I go. Oop, don't fall scissors. I think it's actually it's the trapped raw edges inside the French seam. Obviously I didn't trim them. This is what happens if you don't trim them enough, is they poke through. So that's what they are, and that's fine. I just need to trim them off when I find them. I might get my little scissors and pull them out and trim them off. But yeah, obviously I didn't quite trim that one short enough inside the French seam. But that's okay. Dropping the scissors. That's all right. All right, so I might go ahead and look. I was going to call it there. My scissors just went under the sofa, didn't they? They're there. I might do one of the hems on the ruffle cuff for you, just so you can see how it actually goes. So I'm going to put my tray back on the sewing machine. Okay. And so normally you can fold and pin and fold and iron and pin, but she suggests the pattern designer just suggests folding it as you go. So I'm actually going to turn one of these sleeves inside out. So turn it inside. Here, I've got one. And so I'm actually just going to take this sleeve and I'm just going to turn it up 1/4 inch. And I'm going to use my handy seam gauge. This is a little ruler here. I'm going to set it to 1/4 inch. Let me just check the instructions. That's what it was, right? It was 1/4 inch for the hem. Quarter inch, yeah, 1/4 inch. So I'm setting that to 1/4 inch, and I'm just not even going to bother turning it up and pressing it. I'm just going to turn it up and sew it as I go by eyeballing it, because it's a ruffle. It's not the end of the world if it's too much. Just kind of finger press it down. About right. Yeah, maybe a little more. That's about right. And then I'm going to kind of sew down the middle of that 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to go. I'm actually not going to backtrack because I'm going to sew in a circle and come back around to there. So I'm just folding it over 1/4 inch. I'm using my row gauge every now and then to check, or my stitch gauge, sorry, seam gauge, to check the depth. And I'm kind of sewing about 2/3 of the way across, so close to the cut edge, but not right against it. Making sure I'm not sewing over the other side of the cuff. 1/4 inch. Once you get it going, you can kind of just eyeball it and keep it consistent. You can see just sort of measuring it as I go, just to make sure I'm not suddenly taking too much on one side. And we're just going to end up folding this over twice. It's actually quite a quick way of doing it. Okay, and then there's the beginning again, so I'm just going to fold that last little bit down. And that's right back where I started. Cut. All right, so we've just folded it over a tiny bit, 1/4 of an inch. I'll trim my ends. And you don't want to leave it there because you do have a raw edge on the inside, and we don't want that raw edge to unravel. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to fold it over a second time. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing, folding it over a second time. Actually, it folds quite nicely. Another 1/4 of an inch. And basically I'm going to sew on the same line that I sewed on the first time. Fold it over and just sew on my same stitching line. Just go slow over that side seam. There we go. Now I can just kind of eyeball it. This is a very quick way to hem. You know, it's not the neatest, but it's a roughly cuff. It's not like, you're going to notice if it's not perfect. Time is at 7 o'clock. Whew. Oh. We can eat a little later. We can eat a little later. I'm just folding it over and sewing on this line from before. Oh, what was that? What was that sound? Oh, it's my bobbin thread. No, we were so close. So close to being done. And my bobbin thread has run out. Well, that means I need to wind a bobbin and finish sewing that cuff. So folks, I'm probably going to call it there. But you get the idea. So we'd do the other cuff the same. Then I would do the bottom hem. And again, the bottom is supposed to be 1 centimeter. I will probably try and do a bit less than that. Might do like 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch just to see if I can then get a little extra length in the body, just a tiny bit. And then it'll be done. And so I'll post it on my blog, as I said, web-goddess.org. Thanks for watching and hanging around. I saw I had one person still hanging around to the end. So Thank you so much, whoever that was hanging around. You can subscribe to my channel and find out when I next knit or sew. As I said, it'll probably be knitting and it'll probably be Sunday morning, but we'll see. And YouTube, if you subscribe to my YouTube channel, that's where I archive everything over to there. So thanks for joining me in the craft room today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your holiday. If you are taking some time off, if you're already back at work, commiserations. I will be back next week. Thanks a lot, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.